Hello and welcome to ACS to ISE Migration, part 2 of the 3-part series. This video tutorial will focus on how to prep your environment, how to stage your environment to become migration ready. This has all the information, the best practices, the do's and don'ts, the configuration exceptions, methods to fix these configuration exceptions, and so on. So please pay attention to the details provided in this video tutorial. If you are looking for information related to planning your deployment, you can find this information in the part 1 of this video series. It is available in the community site. All this information related to the planning and the preparation and the migration is also available in the how-to guide in the community site. My name is Krishnan Thiruvengadam. I'm a technical marketing engineer from the Policy and Access team. Here is the agenda for this discussion. First, we will discuss the configuration areas and map the location between ACS and ISE to figure out where to go in ACS and ISE for configuring certain objects and certain areas. We will discuss configuration exceptions, and then we will take a look at how to stage your environment, what are the best practices, and then we will look at the migration tool prerequisites and prerequisites for your environment to become migration ready. This information is already available, as I said, in the migration guide, doc 65715. The part 1, the planning section I talked about earlier, is available in doc 68794. The links are provided in the slide deck and this video tutorial. Before going deep dive into configuration maps, the first best practice I would suggest is to clean up your environment, clean up your ACS policies especially. Your ACS might be used for a very long time. It might have gone through several migrations and upgrades. So if you have outdated policies, please clean that up and use hit counts to identify unused rules. And this will help in limiting your migration objects, and it'll also help in understanding your migration policies better to fit to your new environment. Let's first discuss about the ACS UI and how it's been laid out from a configuration area perspective, right? And our discussion related to configuration gaps will have all these sections prioritized in the top-down way as laid out in the ACS UI. Network resources, users and identity stores, policy elements, access policies, and so on. In ISE, there is a concept of work centers. All these configuration areas in ACS can be configured using work centers in ISE. ISE 2.1 expanded the work center concept to include network access as well. So you have to open up the work centers and click on the appropriate menu to configure the appropriate areas. If you want to do system administration task, you have to click on administration and system, and you can configure your deployment, licensing, certificates, logging, backup restore, and so on. First, let's take a look at network resources. This covers network device groups as well as network devices. ISE in general has a stringent naming constraints because ISE is by default configured to be a more secure system. So it allows only certain characters, including alphanumerics, hyphen, underscore, and period in ISE 2.1 especially. Network device groups can have space characters. So if your network device group names in ACS have any special characters such as backslash or parentheses, you might want to convert that to these supported characters. ISE and ACS have some default pre-existing names for network device groups, location and device type, for example. Please do not change the default name for these things. The migration will not be carried over. If you are using IP ranges for network devices, this is not supported in ISE 2.1. And we have plans to support this feature in the next release. As a workaround, we are trying to enhance the migration tool and make it available as a standalone tool. And this is also being planned, and this is not committed yet, and it is going through development and validation right now. As part of the enhancements for the migration tool, it will include support for IP ranges in the 4th octet of the IPv4 address. Remember, if you are using ACS proxies, to avoid any confusion between TACACS and radius, please use suffixes for these. All this information is available in the How to Migrate guide, Doc 65714. The next we will talk about user and identity groups. As I mentioned earlier, ISE has stringent naming constraints, so please make sure your users and user identity groups do not have other special characters not mentioned here. ISE supports alphanumeric and certain special characters. Usually, in my experience, migrating user and user identity groups would be a straightforward task. However, if you are using special characters such as space or parentheses or backslash, then you might want to go back to your ACS and fix those names. Next point. ISE does not support wildcards in the MAC address. ACS supports it. ISE also supports valid MAC address based on 6 octets separated by a colon or a period or a hyphen. Make sure your MAC addresses support these formats. As part of the best practice, please make sure the user passwords have 8 characters or more. If you're using ACS 5.7 and 5.8, please disable the password hashing for the users. Enabling it makes the passwords not migratable. If you're using external ID stores, such as RSA, there are certain fields and certain resources that needs to be manually copied over, for instance, the instance file. So this information is also available in the How to Migrate guide, Doc 65714. And lastly, the certificate authority certificates will not be migrated as well. So if you have third-party dependencies using certificate authority certificates in ACS, please manually copy them over to ISE. Policy and policy elements. Here, ISE shares the namespace between radius and TACACS, so the names have to be unique for both the policies and policy elements. This applies to the authorization policy, policy elements such as authorization profile, shell profiles, and so on. So if you are using TACACS shell profiles, please use certain prefixes so that you understand that these are specific to TACACS. Hit counts are not supported in ISE. This is again something planned for the next release as well. When you are using access policies in ACS, the supported operators can include a combination of AND and OR. ISE only supports either AND or OR, not a combination of that. And this is again something planned for the next release as well. All these planned features are not committed features. Please remember that. And I would take this as a warning. This is entirely up to the engineering and the product marketing team to prioritize based on customer feedback and feedback from the field what features go in a certain release. The information related to unsupported operators is also available in the part 1 of the video series covering the planning section. Group mapping is not supported, and it will never be supported in ISE. This is because you can use the inline condition in the authorization policy to configure group mapping in ISE using a whole slew of attributes that are supported by ISE, including external ID groups and so on. Finally, network conditions or network access restrictions and maximum concurrent sessions are not supported currently in ISE. This includes custom conditions as well. However, there are plans to include this in the next release of ISE. Reporting and system administration. None of these, or 90% of these configuration objects, will not be carried over to ISE. Reports will not be migrated. Deployment information specific to ACS, backups, certificates, account administration settings will not be migrated. Certain user and endpoint attribute types will not be migrated as well. The complete information you can find in the How to Migration Guide. For those who are looking for specific objects supported or unsupported or partially supported, there are two places where you can go. One is the How To Guide. Page 22 would cover that. And the second one is the migration tool. When you open up the migration tool, this would be the first or the second screen that you will be looking at. It has all the information related to objects supported and unsupported. So in summary, for access policy, please remove your group mapping. And this group mapping feature was carried over from ACS 4.2. Split the authorization policies. If you're using combinatorial condition using and or. Service selection rules will be migrated to policy sets. Service selection policy defaults will be defaults for the authorization policies as well in these policy sets. Since ISE shares a namespace between TACACS and radius, please make use of unique names for TACACS and radius. Access Services Protocol will be transferred to ISE Authentication Allowed Protocol. You can go to the policy elements in the Work Center and go to Results Authentication to look at the allowed protocols. For policy elements, the names have to be unique. In my experience, shell profile and command sets are transferred with no problems. Again, like if you are migrating network devices, groups, users and user groups, fix the naming constraints. And if you have IP ranges in the network devices, if you can, separate them into subnets. The next, we will talk about the staging environment. This staging environment is highly recommended. Please do not use your production system for performing the migration. Install a temporary ACS server in your staging environment and a temporary ISE server as well. Remember, currently the migration tool will only work with a clean installation of the ISE server. The information related to installation is available in the How To Guide. And this slide deck and the video tutorial does not cover that. You also need a Windows machine, preferably Windows 7 or upwards, to install the migration tool and get the migration process started. Further, this Windows machine should be connected directly to ACS and ISE. The Windows machine cannot be NATed behind a router or a firewall. This is because the migration tool verifies the IP address of the host name it is connecting to. And if the IP address is incorrect, it will throw an error. Please make sure the ACS and ISE server are connected to the Active Directory and the LDAP environment. This is to make sure that any attributes from the Active Directory and the LDAP in ACS are migrated over to ISE. Once you install the ISE server, the first thing you'll have to do is licensing and enabling the device admin service. For licensing, the evaluation license has to cover the TACACS and base licenses. Once you do that, then go to Administration Systems, select the node that you want to edit. Once you edit the node, then it opens up this page, and you have to enable the device admin service as mentioned here under the policy services section in the personas in the general settings tab. Once you complete those tasks, please make sure you take a clean backup of both ACS and ISE. Also, once you are ready, then restore the production backup from ACS production environment to the staging environment and make sure the backup is restored successfully. And after that, go to this Work Center to download the migration tool. In the Work Center, if you go to Device Administration Overview page in the Prepare section, you will have a link to the migration tool. You also have a direct link to the migration tool when you open up a browser. I will show that link in a little bit. So once you click on the migration tool and download it, and this is the screen you will see when you open up the migration tool. Next, we will take a look at some of the migration tool requirements. These are some of the migration tool prerequisites. It requires Java on a Windows machine, so please turn on Java on a Windows machine. It supports JRE 7 and upwards. It also needs 2 GB RAM and 1 GB hard disk at a minimum. Also take a look at the how-to guide to set up the config.bat file with a maximum heap size for Java. The download of the tool can be done using a browser, and this is the URL provided in this slide: https the hostname /admin/ migtool.zip, or you can go to the Work Center. Once you download the tool, save it to your local folder and unzip the file. Extract the zip file to your local folder. It'll automatically create a folder called migtool, and under the folder migtool you will have these folders and files. The important file that you will be using for migration is the migration.bat, and that's the file you need to double click on to open up the migration tool. The migration tool live logs and the activity logs are stored in the migration.txt file. This can be opened using a text editor. The reports folder will give you information about the import, export, and the policy gap analysis reports. Now, once you understand the migration tool folder structure, you'll double click on the migration.bat to open up the tool and go to the Settings tab, Trusted Certificates, and import the ACS self-signed certificate. If you have CA signed certificates, you need to install the root CA and any intermediate CAs here. This is applicable both to ACS and ISE. This is a very important task because the migration tool verifies the ACS and the ISE certificates using the CA certificates imported here. There are a few other important pre-migration steps. Those are enabling the migration interface using the CLI in both ACS and ISE. So you have to log into the ACS CLI and enable the config web interface, and also you need to enable the migration in ISE using the ISE CLI. This is a very important thing to do. For the migration tool, to connect to both ACS and ISE. The second important thing is to add entries in the DNS for the fully qualified name of ACS and ISE as in the certificate. The certificate will have a host name, and please make sure the DNS name matches the host name. If you do not have DNS, please update the host file in the Windows System 32 directory with a host name to IP entry. Again, as a warning, I would say that the Windows machine cannot be behind a NAT device. It needs to be directly connected to the ACS and ISE. And this is a summary of some of the prerequisites that we discussed before for your reference. So, having discussed how to prepare your environment and the configuration gaps, how to fix it, as well as information on preparing your staging environment, some of the top of the mind questions are listed here. So how long does it take for migration to complete? This is a question asked repeatedly from the field and from advanced services as well. It actually depends on the number of AAA clients and the configuration. In my experience, a deployment that has 16,000 network device entries took around 5 hours to export and 1.5 hours to import. It usually takes a long time for the predefined attributes if the number of AAA clients and the network devices is large. In this case, it took around 3 hours for the predefined attributes to export and 1.5 hours for the network devices to export. This environment did not have a lot of users. If you have a large number of users, it might require a little more time. The migration tool guide in Cisco.com website for ISE 2.1 gives you an idea about the migration time for a very large deployment. In case you have 300,000 users, 100,000 network devices, 150,000 endpoints with 600 authorization policy, 300 authorization rules, with 25 access services and 50 service selection policies, and a large number of other attributes, it took around a little more than 2 days, 48 hours, for the migration to complete. So the total time completing the migration varies depending on the configuration, how large your deployment is, how many objects you have in your ACS configuration. The second question is, what kind of firewall ports do I need to open up? Please remember, the Windows machine cannot be behind a NAT device. And the migration tool uses REST API to talk to ACS and ISE. So it uses HTTPS. You can open up port 443 if you are behind a firewall. These are some of the licensing information and references mentioned in this slide deck. Please take a note of it. If you are interested in any part of the migration, please go to the community site, and that'll have tons of information. Also, this video tutorial would be published in the community site as well, which will contain all the references and links to other documents. This concludes part 2 of the video series covering preparation for migration. If you are looking for part 1, you can look at the ACS to ISE migration section in the community site, which has links to the planning, which is the part 1 of the migration. The next part in this video series would cover the migration process, which will include import, export, policy gap analysis, and verification. Thank you everyone for listening, and good luck in preparing your environment for migration.